Okay. Hello, 21 January, this and that, autonomous collective, Heinrich, Appendix 5. So we've looked at Appendix 4. We looked at Appendix 6. I think we looked at Appendix either 1 or 2, and I can't remember. And so now we're at Appendix 5 for all the usual kinds of reasons. Um, and it may sound like I'm repeating something, but it's still kind of necessary. Uh, and I may even be repeating it, but I think it's still worth looking at. After examining the simple circulation, this is Heinrich, Appendix 5 from the commentary and explanations on the beginning chapters of How to Read Capital, the first 7 chapters, and Appendix 5 on the transition to capital, which in our little diagram is the idea that, you start with the commodity, you work up through the commodity form, money, you get the money, and then you get to capital eventually. After examining the simple circulation of commodities in part 1 of Capital, Marx turns in part 2 to the form of circulation MCM. He approaches it as an empirical fact. Alongside the form CMC, according to Marx, we find another form which is quite distinct from the first, MCM. Marx does not make explicit here whether he considers the relationship between the simple circulation of commodities and the form MCM to be a necessary or accidental one. However, in a footnote, he indicates that he by no means assumes the connection to be coincidental. The capitalist epoch is therefore characterized by the fact that labor power, in the eyes of the worker himself, takes on the form of a commodity which is his property. His labor consequently takes on the form of waged labor. On the other hand, it is only from this moment that the commodity form of the products of labor becomes universal. Hence, the simple circulation of commodities is not only a precondition of money's transformation into capital, but commodity circulation only becomes generalized as a result of capital. However, this is merely a historical claim and does not show why it is so. Only in the Grundrisse and in the so-called Urtext, that is the original text of a contribution to the critique of political economy of 1858, the Grundrisse is 1857 to 1858, does Marx show the necessary interrelation of simple commodity circulation and the transformation of money into capital. There, he not only tries to demonstrate that simple commodity circulation leads to the category of money in the sense of money's third form, that is, money as money, but also that money must transform into capital to really exist as an independent manifestation of value. If this connection really holds, then generalized commodity production can only exist as capitalist commodity production. Just as commodity production cannot exist without money, as Marx showed in the value form analysis of chapters 1 and 2, using the connection to critique Proudhon's conception of socialism, so simple commodity circulation cannot exist without capital. On a categorical level, this implies a fundamental critique of the possibility of market socialism. That is, market socialism proposes eliminating the capital relation from all enterprises in favor of cooperatives that will continue to produce commodities and compete on the market. In what follows, I comment on several passages from the 6th section of the Urtext's 2nd chapter, a commentary on the entire section, which bears the title The Transition to Capital, is beyond the scope of this book, because Marx's text is both lengthy and inchoate. Confident presentation and the search for such a presentation alternate, making for many repetitions and new beginnings, much like this one. Therefore, I have selected those passages where the central arguments for the transition to capital are clearest. Moreover, my commentary only addresses what is important for understanding the transition. In the passages reproduced below, Marx does not yet distinguish terminologically between value and exchange value, that is, the form of appearance of value. For that reason, exchange value, quote unquote, should be replaced by value in most of the passages. To improve readability, however, I have refrained from indicating this inside the quotes. In what follows, the page numbers refer to MECW. This is the Marx Engels Collected Works. Marx's emphases are in italics, whereas mine are underlined. So there are underlinings that I think I included in here. And the italics are not there. They are in the original text, which you can go to the original link on, because I put Marx's the quotes from Marx in italics in this version, but you can go to the original Heinrich Appendix 5 and sort of see that. Considered in itself, circulation is the mediation of pre-posited extremes. But it does not posit these extremes. It itself must be mediated as the totality of mediation, as total process. That is why its immediate being is pure appearance. It is the phenomenon of a process running behind its back. The repetition of the process from both points, that is, money and commodity, does not spring from the conditions of circulation itself. The act cannot again be rekindled of itself. Circulation does not, therefore, carry within itself the principle of self-renewal. It proceeds from pre-posited moments and not from those created by itself. Commodities must be thrown into it again and again, and that from outside as fuel into the fire. Otherwise, it flickers out in indifference. It would flicker out in money as an indifferent result, insofar as money would no longer have any connection with commodities, prices, circulation, cease to be money, and express a production relationship, leaving no more than its metallic being with its economic being annihilated. That's Marx. Circulation, the Heinrich. Circulation mediates between the extremes of the commodity and money. These are pre-posited in that they exist without circulation's influence. Circulation on its own cannot generate these extremes, which is why Marx says that circulation does not carry within itself the principle of self-renewal. Hence, circulation depends on another process. Because this process is not visible from the perspective of circulation, it is thus running behind its back. When Marx says that circulation's immediate being is pure appearance, he is denying that circulation exists immediately, that is, without mediation or independent of anything else. Circulation does not exist immediately, but rather is mediated by another process. If this other process ceases to take place, then circulation stops, and the money that remains would no longer be money, since there would be no commodities that it could buy. In a text placed in side brackets, Marx looks briefly at the historical development of circulation. The simple circulation, merely the exchange of commodity and money, the exchange of commodities in mediated form, precisely because it's only mediating movement between presupposed points of departure, can, up to the formation of hordes, historically exist without exchange value taking hold of the production of a people, whether on the whole surface or in its depths. At the same time, however, historical development shows how circulation itself leads to bourgeois, that is, exchange positing production, and creates for itself a basis other than that from which it directly sprang. The exchange of surpluses is commerce creating exchange and exchange value. However, extends only to the act of exchange itself and runs alongside production itself. But then, if the appearance of exchange-seeking mediaries, that is, Lombards, Normans, etc., is repeated and regular trade develops under which the producing peoples are engaged only in what could be called passive trade, insofar as the impetus to exchange creating activity comes from outside and not from the inner structure of production, the surplus of production must no longer be an accidental, occasional one, but a constantly recurring surplus, so that the product itself acquires a tendency towards circulation and creation of new exchange values. Now, here, Marx explains how, in the course of history, production that occasionally generates surpluses, which are not for exchange, ultimately leads to production for exchange. He also briefly describes this process in Chapter 2 of Capital. You'll all remember that, of course. Marx could turn next to describing the historical steps leading up to capitalist production. However, as he points out, this is not the issue here. At this point, however, we have nothing to do with the historical transition of circulation into capital. The simple circulation is rather an abstract sphere of the bourgeois process of production as a whole, which through its own determinations shows itself to be a moment, a mere form of appearance of some deeper process lying behind it, even resulting from it and producing it, that is, industrial capital. This statement clarifies two things. One is that the phrase simple circulation, or the simple circulation of commodities, as Marx writes in Capital, does not refer to pre-capitalist relations. Second, we see how Marx's aim is to show how simple circulation, through its own determinations, reveals itself to be a form of appearance of industrial capital. This means that simple circulation, if it is comprehensive and universal, cannot be anything other than the surface of the capitalist process of reproduction. Marx now explores this second point. This is Marx. What emerges, is produced in circulation when its form itself is considered, is money itself and nothing else. Commodities are exchanged in circulation, but they do not originate in it. Money, as price and coin, meaning the first two forms of money, a measure of value and means of circulation, is already an own product of circulation, but only formally. The exchange value of the commodity is the premise of price, just as the coin itself is nothing but the self-established form of the commodity, as similarly premised means of exchange. As Marx pointed out earlier, we're not looking at with a historical transition. The term originating does not refer to emerging in history, but rather a process that happens in circulation every day and can be revealed by considering the process of circulation. Circulation generates money in an ongoing way. However, the first two functions of money, that is, measure of value, means of circulation, are merely formal products of circulation, since they express something that already exists in the commodity. But things stand differently with money, that is, meaning the third function of money, or money as money. It is a product of circulation which has grown out of it, as it were, contrary to initial agreement. Money is not merely a mediating form of commodity exchange. It is a form of exchange value growing out of the circulation process, a social product which, in virtue of the relations into which individuals enter in circulation, creates itself. As soon as gold and silver, or any other commodity, have developed themselves as measure of value and means of circulation, as the latter, whether in bodily form or as symbol, they become money without the society's aid or desire. The third function of money, money as an independent manifestation of value, is the true product of circulation. It is something new, not yet present in the commodity. Value is just one of the two factors of a commodity. It is only with money as money that value comes to exist in an independent shape, that is, in a form in which it is not simply present in the commodity. However, we soon see that this is not really independent value at all, since money's independent attitude with respect to circulation, its withdrawal from the latter, robs it of both its values, of its use value, since it does not have to serve as metal, of its exchange value, since it possesses the exchange value only as a moment of circulation, as an abstract symbol of the commodity's own value, reciprocally opposed to each other, as a moment of the movement of the form of the commodity itself. So long as money remains withdrawn from circulation, it is as worthless as if it lay buried in the deepest pit. But if it re-enters circulation, its intransience is at an end. The value it contains disappears in the use values of the commodities for which it is exchanged. And it once again becomes a mere means of circulation. Hence, money cannot retain its independent value outside of circulation. As a hoard, it loses both its use value and exchange value, while within circulation, it loses its imperishability and therefore its independence. In an earlier passage, Marx made this even clearer. Money, as a universal form of wealth, as exchange value become independent, confronts the whole world of real wealth. It is the pure abstraction of the latter, hence fixed in this way an imaginary magnitude. Wherever universal wealth appears to exist in an entirely material, tangible form, it has its existence only in my head and is a pure chimera. As the material representative of universal wealth, money is realized only when it's thrown back into circulation. When it disappears in exchange for the particular species of wealth in circulation, it is always real only when it is given out. Should I want to hold on to it, it evaporates in my hands as a mere specter of wealth. Making it disappear is the only possible way of securing it as wealth. The dissolution of the stores and ephemeral gratifications is its realization. It can now again be stored by other individuals, but then the process starts once again. The independence of money with respect to circulation is mere appearance, or that is semblance. So in its determination of consummate exchange value, money sublates itself. Money, as an independent manifestation of value, results from simple circulation, but at the same time, its independence is mere semblance. This independence cannot exist within simple circulation. This means that within the framework of simple circulation, we cannot get all the determinations of money. Therefore, we need a further determination, another categorical development. How can money, as an independent manifestation of value, maintain itself as the general form of wealth? Based on the analysis so far, Marx begins to lay out the requirements that must be fulfilled. Back to Marx. If money is to be preserved as money, it must, just as it appears in the form of residue, and the result of the process of circulation, be capable of re-entering this process, i.e., of not being converted in circulation into a mere means of circulation, disappearing in the form of commodity in exchange for a mere use value. Money, while it is in one determination, should not be lost in the other, i.e., it should remain money also in its being as commodity and in its being as money, exist only as a transient form of commodity. In its being as commodity, it should not lose its exchange value. And in its being as money, its relation to use value. Its entry into circulation must itself be a moment of its stay by itself, and its stay by itself entry into circulation. Thus, the exchange value is now determined as a process and not merely as a disappearing form of use value, indifferent to this use value itself as physical content, and not merely as a thing in the form of money. It is determined as a relation to its own self through the process of circulation. Now, if back to Heinrich, if money is to maintain itself as an independent manifestation of value, it cannot just enter circulation and buy any commodity. Instead, money must enter circulation in a specific way. It must do so in a way that allows it to remain an independent manifestation of value. We still don't know what this special way of entering circulation is in a concrete sense. However, Marx concludes that if this way of entering circulation exists, value must be part of a process involving constant changing of form between the commodity and the means of circulation. If money as an independent manifestation of value results from circulation and can only exist as a process, then what is this process's content? Prior to the passage just quoted above, Marx wrote, as the aim of exchange, i.e., as movement which has for its content exchange value itself, money itself, the only content of the process is an increase of exchange value. accumulation of money. Hoarding itself involves accumulation, but of a merely formal kind. Value that was circulation as a commodity is simply withdrawn as money. Here we're looking at for something different from merely formal accumulation. This means that a further requirement is that money must enter circulation as an independent manifestation of value to reappear in its adequate form as adequate exchange value, but simultaneously as multiplied, increased exchange value, valorized exchange value. Value valorizing, that is, multiplying itself in circulation, is in general exchange value for itself, which passes through circulation as an end in itself. This valorization, this quantitative increase of value, the only process which value can perform as such, appears in the accumulation of money, that is, as hoarding, only as the opposite of circulation, that is, through its own sublation. Moreover, circulation must itself be posited as a process in which value is retained and valorized. Now, that seems to be contradictory, and I think Heinrich kind of sorts that out. Yet, how can circulation be a process where value preserves itself and yet grows? Marx continues. In circulation, however, money becomes coin, and as such is exchanged for commodity. If this exchange is to be more than formal, if the exchange value is not to be lost in the consumption of the commodity, so that there is not merely a change in the form of the exchange value once as its universal abstract being in money, and again, its being in particular use value of the commodity, the exchange value must in fact be exchanged for a use value, and the commodity must be consumed as a use value, but in this consumption, it must be retained as an exchange value. In other words, its disappearance must disappear, and yet itself must be a means for the emergence of a greater exchange value, for the reproduction and production of exchange value, that is productive consumption, that is consumption through labor in order to objectify labor to create exchange value. Now, that does sound contradictory, but he's trying to make a more subtle point about the question of exchange, in that under capitalism, exchange kind of motivates, has a certain kind of motivation, and that it is there is a kind of accretion going on. Increasing value in circulation can only happen if consuming the purchased commodity itself becomes a way of generating increased value. This is productive consumption through value creating labor. However, it is still not clear exactly what commodity must be purchased to carry out this kind of productive consumption. So far, Marx has simply formulated the requirement. Independent value entering into circulation for the sake of valorization is not a one-time process. Marx explains how the process of multiplying value is endless by appealing to the contradiction between independent value being qualitatively unlimited but quantitatively limited inasmuch as any particular value has only a limited magnitude. That is, Marx says, as a form of universal wealth, as exchange value become independent, money is incapable of any other movement but the quantitative one, to expand itself. By concept, it is the essence of all the use values, but its quantitative limits, as the limits of what is always a definite magnitude of value, a definite sum of gold and silver, is in contradiction with its quality. That is why, rooted in its nature, is a constant drive to go beyond its own limits. So enrichment is an end in itself. The end-determining activity of exchange value become independent can only be enrichment, that is its own self-expansion. So fixed as wealth, as the universal form of wealth, as value that counts as value, money is a constant drive to go beyond its quantitative limits, an endless process. Its own viability consists exclusively in this. It preserves itself as self-important value distinct from use value only when it is continually multiplies itself by the means of the process of exchange itself. The active value is only a surplus value positing value. So this is that moment where you can create a kind of, or at least measure surplus value. Now back to Heinrich. Marx has now characterized money as truly independent value, as value in process, value that multiplies itself through an endless process, which is an end in itself. In this way, he has identified capital's key determinations. Marx now concludes, this Marx, resulting from circulation as adequate exchange value and independent, but again entering circulation in it and through it, perpetuating and valorizing, that is, multiplying itself, money is capital. In capital, money has lost its rigidity and from a tangible thing has become a process. Money and commodity as such, just as a simple circulation itself exists for capital merely as particular abstract moments of its being in which it just as continually appears, passing from the one into the other, and just as continually disappears. The process of becoming independent appears not only in the form that capital confronts circulation as an independent abstract exchange value, that is money, but also in that circulation is simultaneously the process of its becoming independent, that it stems from circulation as something become independent. Marx's work in revealing capital's properties roughly corresponds to what he demonstrates in the form analysis in Capital's chapter 4. However, Marx's starting point in capital is the form of circulation, that is MCM, or MCM prime, the existence of which he simply presupposes. By contrast, the Or text, that is of 1858, actually demonstrates how these properties of capital follow from the categorical determinations of money's third function, money as money. With that, Marx makes good on his claim at the beginning of this subsection of the Or text. He has shown that the very characteristics of simple circulation show it to be a result of a deeper underlying process. Money with its third function, this is Heinrich now, money with its third function, money as money, can only acquire a real existence when it repeatedly enters circulation as part of a valorization process. Otherwise, its independent existence will remain illusory, as with hoarding. In this way, Marx demonstrates that the characteristics of generalized simple commodity circulation depend on its being the expression of an underlying capitalist valorization process. If this capitalist valorization process is not present, then simple circulation will not be completely developed. Its characteristics will not really exist. Both in chapter 4 of Capital and here at the end of the Or text section, the transition to capital, value emerges as value in process that yields surplus value. But these determinations of value are still no more than requirements. In the Or text of 1858, they emerge as requirements to be fulfilled for money as truly independent value. In capital, the requirements arise from the existence of the circulation formula MCM prime. However, we still don't know how it is possible to fulfill these requirements. The Or text points to productive consumption, quote unquote, but we still don't know how productive consumption makes value that generates surplus value possible. In Capital, Marx explicitly asks how it's possible to create surplus value if we assume the exchange of equivalents. In chapter 5, he criticizes a series of inadequate solutions to this problem. In chapter 6, however, Marx finally presents the first part of the answer. It involves the purchase and sale of a special commodity, that is, labor power. The second part of the answer comes in chapter 7. This is why Heinrich generally just focuses on 1 through 7 to try and get all of these comments out. In the Or text, Marx still did not clearly distinguish between labor and labor power. The Or text uses the German phrase Arbeitsvermögen, or labor capacity, whereas in Capital, it's Arbeitskraft, or labor power. Marx even equates living labor and labor power in a few passages and does not make a precise analysis of the commodity labor power. Instead, in the section that follows, the transition of money into capital, he attempts to characterize what constitutes the opposite of money as capital. Now, it can't be commodities since money as capital passes into any form of commodity whatsoever. Because money, this is Heinrich again, because money as the form of all commodities represents objectified labor, its opposite could only be unreified labor or living labor, which only exists as a capacity of the living subject. However, the capacity for living labor, that is, existing in the living subject, independently of whether that subject works or not, must be distinguished from living labor itself, which only exists when the living subject actually works. But Marx does not tell us why the transformation of money into capital can only be explained by an exchange with the opposite of capital, nor is it very plausible to say that the commodities can't be this opposite because they exchange for capital, but then explain the transformation of money into capital precisely because it does exchange with its opposite labor. Here, Marx is not able to explain fully why capital's exchange with labor is so fundamentally different from capital's exchange with other commodities. Now, the vagueness of Marx's reasoning becomes especially clear in this passage, which summarizes the argument. So, this is Marx. Money exists as capital only in connection with non-capital, the negation of capital in relation to which alone it is capital. Labor itself is the real non-capital. The first step made by money to become capital is its exchange with the labor capacity, so as by means of the latter to transform the consumption of the commodities, that is, their real positing and negation, as use values simultaneously into their actualization of exchange value. So Charlie the tuna, tunas that taste good. The exchange through which money becomes capital cannot be its exchange with commodities in general, but can only be one with its conceptually determined opposite, that is, the commodity which is itself a conceptually determined opposite of it, that is, labor. In the first paragraph, Marx says that money becomes capital by exchanging for labor capacity. But in the second, he says that money becomes capital by exchanging for labor. Marx is not yet really clear about the difference between exchanging for the commodity that is labor power and exchanging for labor, which is not a viable commodity and also has no value, but rather creates value. See chapter 19 of Capital and the concluding part of Heinrich's commentary on chapter 7. In the Ur text of 1858, Marx is beginning to chart out an explanation of surplus value creation, but he hasn't arrived at it yet. The Ur text constitutes an important supplement to the analysis in Capital because in the section Transition to Capital, it demonstrates the categorical relationship between money and capital. However, the material under the heading, the transformation of money into capital, suffers from an inadequate conception of the commodity labor power. For this reason, the last considerations fall short of really being a truly helpful supplement to Marx's account in Capital. So we get to the end here, and Heinrich sort of says, well, it's still pretty vague, but he is kind of getting there. And Marx is trying to work through to get there, and you can see that this is the result of several different manuscripts, right? We sort of begin with the Grundrisse and then sort of ignore it and then move on to the Ur text and then move on further. By the time we get to Capital, other things have happened. And that's perhaps why Engels doesn't quite get the job done when he tries to outline all this business. Endnote 63 in his drafts, Marx sometimes put longer notes inside brackets. He would write down a note to preserve a thought, but the brackets indicate this is not the final place for the note. Endnote 64, both the conception of labor as non-capital and the claim that the transformation of money into capital turns on the relationship of opposite were important for Italian aphorismo and the text of Antonio Negri in particular. So we've come back, as I've said before, to reference to the kind of demand for workers' autonomy that post-war Italian aphorismo kind of insists on in that sense. So there's an underlying set of ideas that that all the early this return to new texts or old texts, as it were, older texts in post-war Marxism have kind of seized back on these kinds of things, so that even the new reading of Marx in the 1960s is a kind of crisis in trying to figure out what these sets of relations are. And so hence the kind of move towards other things, and with all due respect, a kind of distraction into cultural matters, perhaps. So those kinds of things occur as well. So anyway, that's my little yammering for today. Um, I know that may seem transitory, but we've been sort of looking at different aspects. We're looking at this kind of giant globe or sphere that has different little elements on the surface. And this is one of those that Marx is trying to work out at a fairly abstract level, as you can imagine, as you can see, that, how is it that I can explain some of these things as a kind of set of movements or process or transition of one thing to another, and yet all keep it all in the same kind of moment. What is it that occurs when I hoard stuff or when I bring it back into circulation? What is being demanded of me and et cetera, of the commodity when that happens? And it is the simplification of that that can be problematic. So that's a whole nother element as well. Yes, it's a kind of deadly cold now. Um, uh, Bad advice. Yes, I know. There's probably bad advice somewhere. So let me move further to stop share and prepare to cut the live stream, unless there's any really important moment. And I think that's pretty much it. So I'm going to stop the live stream so we can return to our regularly scheduled programming, noting, of course, that we'll have other things probably at the top of the hour, and I've run out of my scheduled time. Let me thank you for your attention, and we'll consider this idea of trying to place things like money and then this issue of commodities and then labor and labor power equivalence all into itself. And it's not a mess so much for Marx. Marx is trying to work through this, and he does work through this in the manuscripts. Some of it seems to be lost, and some of it is because some of the manuscripts are lost, and also because, of course, this is all kind of a piece of a large editing puzzle that Engels engages in. And you can see that there are things that we've had to sort of either take for granted or with great difficulty sometimes set aside to get at what the principal issues are in thinking of labor as a commodity, for example, or labor power as a commodity, which is, why he makes these kinds of moves.